Okay, so today we're going to be talking about addenda and disclosures. So hopefully all of you attended Al's contracts class yesterday. So in Al's contracts class yesterday, you would have learned about the FAR/BAR as-is contract. That is the most common contract that we use here in real estate. So that's the one you should be accustomed to using. However, today I'm going to be talking about a lot of the addenda and disclosures that will go along with your as-is contract. So when you are representing a buyer and you are writing a contract for that buyer, it's not only the contract that you're going to need. There's going to be situations like an HOA rider, seller's property disclosure, and other necessary forms that you're going to need to know about. And that's what we're going to be covering today. So I want to start by sharing my screen. So let me do this real quick. I don't know if you all can see it. Let me stop real quick and share it again. Okay, so what I want to show you real quick is something that's really valuable to you. If you are new to the office, I want to show you a really great YouTube channel that our manager, Javier Santana, out of Sand Lake office has set up for all of you. If any of you need to access any of our old videos from previously recorded classes, go to YouTube, type in Century 21 Karaoke, and you're going to come up with Javier's YouTube channel that he created. And we had him do this because it's a great way for you to be able to access all of those trainings. When you go into that YouTube channel that Javier has created, you're going to see contracts class, listing documents, ZAP class, 21 online, my addenda class. A lot of your training is right here. So you don't have to email us to have us send it to you. You can go right to YouTube and watch all of our videos at your leisure. So that's just a little heads up on that. But let's go ahead and get started on today. So today we're going to be talking about additional addenda and disclosures that you are going to need to use as you create contracts on behalf of your buyers. These are the most frequently used ones, and they're the most important ones that I like agents to know about. The first one we're going to start with is the energy efficiency brochure. But before I do that, I want to show you something in the contract and why we're talking about this particular form. So if all of you have taken Al's contracts class, which you should have taken it yesterday, you would have learned about the as-is contract. However, there's one important little clause that you need to know about. In the bottom of page 4 of the as-is contract, there is something I want to read to you. It says, buyer acknowledges receipt of the Florida Energy Efficiency Rating brochure. So when your buyer signs this offer, they are acknowledging that you have given them the Florida Energy Efficiency brochure. So let me show you what that looks like. So with that said, I'm going to switch over to dot loop. By the way, all of our forms that you're going to need for writing contracts and everything are all going to be in dot loop. So I'm just going to go through, but all of these are available to you. So if you're representing a buyer, you're going to want to add these as you see fit to your contracts. So as you saw what I just mentioned, at the bottom of the contract, it says that the buyer is acknowledging that you've given them this brochure. This is called the Energy Efficiency Brochure. It is nothing more than just a flyer. There is nothing that your buyer will need to sign on this. In fact, there's no place for signatures or initials or anything like that. It's just a disclosure or a brochure that we have to provide to our buyers. So what I would do is, if you are representing a buyer, get in the habit before you start filling out the contract or the offer, send this document to them by email. That way you have it noted that you sent it, you have a paper trail, and they've received this document. So make sure that when you're writing a contract that your buyers have received this little disclosure that talks about energy efficiency rating. This is required of us per the contract, so make sure you are including that. Again, there's nothing your buyer needs to sign, you just have to provide it for them. I like saving it to my desktop because I like being able to just email it to my buyer when I'm preparing the contract. So the next document we're going to be talking about is going to be the C21 buyers and sellers disclosure. So whether you are representing a buyer or if you're representing a seller, whoever we are representing as Century 21 Karaoke, that client needs to sign this form. So whether it's your buyer or if you're representing the seller, whoever it is that we as Century 21 are representing Karaoke, they will need to sign this. This is a disclosure between us and our buyer or seller. It does not need to be shared with the cooperating agent. It just needs to be between us and our client. And what this does is it's our little disclosure from our office to our Century 21 Karaoke buyers and sellers, just talking about necessary things, little disclosures, making sure they get their home inspections and all the different things that we advise them to do. It also protects you, the licensee. So there's a lot of things in here that kind of protect you as well as our company. So we want to make sure that we have this disclosure out there. Last but not least is it does talk about our 365 transaction fee. So as you know, whether you represent a buyer or a seller, there's going to be an additional $365 transaction fee that we will be collecting from your client at closing. This talks about that particular fee and what it goes towards. So make sure that whenever you're representing a buyer, always include the buyers and sellers disclosure addendum. So it really has to be filled out by whoever we represent. So that is our own in-office form that only your client needs to sign, nobody else. The outside client does not need to sign this. This is just between us and our buyers or sellers. I'm going to stop for 1 second. I want to make sure there are no questions and make sure I've got everybody in the room, but I do have a couple questions. Nope, we're good, guys. If you're late getting here, that's no problem at all. I understand. I also know that Zoom was down yesterday because of all the schools going back into session, so I understand that. If you need to ever watch this class again, there is a YouTube channel that you can do that, but no problem at all if you got here a little bit late. Okay, let's go back to my screen. So we talked about the buyers and sellers addendum to disclosure. Make sure you are including this with all of your contracts. The next one we're going to be talking about is going to be the homeowners association disclosure. So if you are representing a buyer and that buyer, that property is located in an HOA where there's a required fee or they're required to join the HOA, this addendum has to be included. Now, normally you would get this from the listing agent. Normally the listing agent already has this filled out. The reason why is the seller and the listing agent are the ones that know this information. They know who the HOA is. They know what the monthly assessments are, any special assessments, things like that. It is absolutely crucial that if you are doing a contract for a buyer and that property is located in a required homeowners association, you have to include this document. The buyer has to know and has to be disclosed of any necessary associations or fees that they have to pay. If you're representing a buyer and that buyer does not have this document, they can actually back out of the contract because they did not get this disclosure. So a lot of times what I would do is if you're representing the buyer, call over to the listing agent before you place the offer and ask them, do you have a completed homeowners association disclosure that I can provide to my buyer to review and sign? So most of the time the listing agent will fill this out. Sometimes they will even attach it as an, put it as an attachment in the MLS so you can get it directly from the MLS. But if you don't have it, feel free to call over to the listing agent and ask for it. Because again, all of this is regarding the HOA. We as buyer's agents don't know this information. So usually it does have to come from the seller and the listing agent. Okay, so that is the HOA or homeowners association and community disclosure. Make sure again, if you're representing a buyer and the property is in a required HOA, they have to include, make sure you include this document with that offer. Okay, so the next form we're going to be talking about is going to be the seller's property disclosure. So I want to talk about this because this is a really important disclosure. Again, this comes directly from the seller. So if you are preparing an offer, it's good practice to call the listing agent and ask them about the HOA disclosure, but also about the seller's property disclosure. You'll notice right here, it says only the seller should fill out this form. This is a questionnaire that allows the seller to be upfront and honest about everything wrong with that property. This is their chance of putting it all out there. Hey, I've had a flood, I've had mold, I've had termites, whatever it is. This is their chance to disclose to the potential buyer every known defect relating to that property. We whether if we're representing the seller, the idea is that the seller is supposed to be as honest as possible. They really need to be. They need to disclose any issues. And this questionnaire gets very detailed. It asks the seller, has there been any roof leaks? Has there been any issues with the plumbing or the heating system? Has there ever been any termites or wood destroying organisms? Has there ever been any water intrusion or mold? Was there any issues with plumbing? Roof related expenses, pools, whatever it is, sinkholes, HOA issues. Has there ever been any litigation that you know of? So this is a really, really thorough questionnaire that we want the sellers to fill out. The reason why is, even though we always suggest our buyers to get a home inspection, we want to ask the seller, is there anything we need to know about this property? Sellers need to be as honest as possible, because guess what happens if they're not honest? If our buyer's getting a home inspection done, that home inspector is probably going to find out that something happened. So let me tell you in a scenario. Let's say we have a seller that had a potential, actually, let me tell you a real situation. I'll back this up. I'll tell you a real situation. My parents up in Georgia sold their property a couple years ago. Now, they had a flood in their basement a couple years prior to them selling it. They had gotten the water damage taken care of. They had refixed the walls. They looked beautiful, all redone, very nice. My dad, however, forgot to mention on the seller's property disclosure that there had been a water issue. So my dad calls me halfway through the transaction. Of course, they're dealing with a Georgia real estate agent. And he calls me and says, should I disclose this to the potential buyer? And I said, absolutely, Dad. You need to disclose and be as honest as possible. Because when that buyer goes and gets a home inspection and that home inspector comes back and says, it looks like there was some sort of a water issue a couple years back, it's going to come back on the seller. So it really is important that sellers are as honest as possible. We like to think that these are as honest as possible. But what's going to happen is, if you're representing the buyer, you're going to simply call over to the listing agent and ask them if they have a completed seller's property disclosure. If they do, they will send it over to you. You'll have the buyer go through and they will initial every page, and then they'll sign the last page acknowledging that they've received this disclosure. It is not required by law for a seller to have a seller's property disclosure. Sometimes you're going to find that a seller hasn't lived in the property. So maybe the seller didn't feel comfortable filling one out, or maybe it's a bank-owned property and the bank's surely not going to fill one out. So sometimes you may not get this seller's property disclosure. But what I advise is call the listing agent, see if they have one completed, have them email it to you, and when you present the offer, you make this part of your offer and you send this back to them. I'm going to stop for 1 second. I'm going to make sure that we don't have any questions. Looks like we have one there. Okay, so a couple questions. Okay, hold on 1 second. Let me see. When do we give the buyers and sellers disclosure? So going back to that C21 disclosure, do it at the time of offer. If you're going through and having all these paperwork signed, just do it at the time of offer. Make the Century 21 buyers and sellers disclosure part of your offer. That way they get it taken care of right away. Okay, the next one is, what is the YouTube channel name? Okay, I'm going to go back to where I was on the YouTube. Actually, I'm just going to tell you, go to YouTube and just search Century 21 Karaoke. You're going to see a channel that says Century 21 Karaoke, Javier Santana. That is Javier's page that he created under our name. So when you go to YouTube, just type in Century 21 Karaoke, Amanda, and you're going to see Javier's page that he created. And I think he's got about 10 or 12 of our videos on there. So I'm really happy he was able to do that, because it takes away some of the back and forth emailing you guys videos and things like that. So thank you. Okay, so we covered that one. Anyone with experience in the market, everything is. Okay, so going back to the seller's property disclosure, if you've had a seller that has never lived in the property, let me go back to that form real quick. Where'd it go? Okay, so on the seller's property disclosure, you'll notice, let me go back to the very top of it. You'll notice that there is a do not know category, right? So there's a don't know category. This is especially relevant to us in Florida. We all know that there's a huge amount of our homes that we sell that are vacation rentals, where the seller may have even bought the property having never stepped in it. He bought it sight unseen. Maybe he rented it out as a vacation home or an Airbnb, never stepped foot in the property. In that situation, you have a seller that knows nothing about that property. They really honestly don't know anything. So you might have a seller go through and mark don't know on every one of these. And that is sometimes common. If you have somebody, maybe you've got an investor up in New York that has 20 properties down here. He doesn't know what's going on with these properties. So he may mark don't know. So again, even though you may request this from the seller, there may be a lot of missing information if that seller doesn't know. So there you may run into the situation, but yeah, that does happen a lot down here because we're in a vacation resort community down here. So thank you, very good question. Okay, so let me see with anybody else. Okay, so rental listings, are there any disclosures? There are not. We really don't get a lot from rental listings. Now, if it's a rental home that is available for sale, then yes, if the seller knows of any issues, they should be telling you. But again, a lot of sellers that, hey, they have 20 properties, they don't know what's going on in the properties, maybe they have a property manager maintaining them, they may not know the knowledge to fill this out. So you try to take it with a grain of salt. If you can get it filled out, that's great, but don't expect it from everyone. Bank-owned properties, you're not going to get a seller's property disclosure from that bank. They're not going to send you one. So there will be situations where you just won't get that disclosure. Okay, perfect. So I think that's all the questions. I'm going to go back to our class. So we talked about the seller's property disclosure. So again, if you're writing an offer for a buyer, there are two important things to ask to get from that listing agent. The number one thing we talked about was the homeowners association. The second one we talked about was the seller's property disclosure. If you can get those from the listing agent, have your buyer sign that at the time of offer and then send everything to the listing agent as one package. Okay, hopefully that helps everybody. Okay, we're going to continue on. Next, we're going to talk about the release and cancellation of contract. Now, I don't like talking about this one because it means that your deal fell apart. And we don't like to talk about it, but guess what? It happens. You're going to have a lot of deals, and guess what? Deals are going to fall apart. Home inspections are going to come back with issues. Your buyer's going to back out. Your buyer's going to realize they can't buy the property. Whatever it is, you will come across this document. I hope very few times, but again, I've seen it way more than I like to care to admit. So this is the release and cancellation of contract. Now, we all know that if your buyer cancels the as-is contract within their home inspection period, or if they've gotten a denial letter before the expiration of their loan approval deadline, we know that they can get their deposit back. So let's say you write a contract and you're within your home inspection period. Your buyer gets their home inspection. The home inspection comes back horrible. There's plumbing issues. There's electrical issues. It needs a new roof. Your buyer decides, Katie, it's way too much for me to take on. I don't want to take on this much expense. I need to back out of this, this contract. So if that's the case, you're going to be preparing the release and cancellation of contract to give your buyer back their deposit. So you'll simply go to this form. You're going to fill in the buyer and seller information. You're going to mark which contract you used, which most likely will be the as-is contract because it is the most frequently used one that we talk about. You're going to put the effective date of the contract, the street address, the legal description. You're going to put both companies here. And then at the bottom right here is where you're going to fill in where the deposit is going back to. So let's say in this case, there was a $5,000 deposit that your buyer has sitting at the title company. They're within their right to cancel the contract. You prepare this document and you write $5,000, oops, to, Jim and Sue Buyer, whoever their names are. Okay, so this is where you're going to prepare the release, canceling, not only canceling the contract, but also giving your buyer back their deposit. And you're going to have your buyer sign this and get this over to the listing agent prior to the expiration of that inspection period. Please keep in mind, and this is just a side note, whenever you're dealing with contracts, the most important thing you can do as an agent is keep track of your important deadlines. Make sure you know, when does my buyer have to have their escrow to the title company? When is the expiration of my home inspection period? When is the expiration of my loan approval deadline? You should be making sure to keep track of these deadlines because they're very important. So if your buyer wants to back out, this is the form they would be using to do that. Just make sure you have your buyer sign it and get it over to the listing agent to have their seller sign it. Once the buyer and seller have signed it, you get this to the title company, and the title company will take care of dispersing the escrow funds back to your buyer so that they can move on to another property. Okay, I'm going to stop for just a second once again to make sure that we don't have any questions. I encourage you guys, if you have any questions, be sure to type them into chat. And it looks like we are good. Thanks, guys. You're doing great. Okay, so let's keep going here. So we talked about the release and cancellation of, no, I don't want to save that. Release and cancellation of contract. Next, we're going to go to the next important one that I want you to know about. And again, today we're just talking about important forms that you're going to see. You're going to see these in every contract. So I really want you guys to be familiar with these. But my big suggestion for you is, if you are new to real estate and this is maybe your first or second contract that you're writing, reach out to your manager, reach out to us, let us know, hey, Katie, I need help writing a contract. Hey, Javier, Joe, I need help writing a contract. Can you help me do this? Or can you give me some advice? Can you check it over on .loop? We're going to make sure that you have some of these necessary addenda and disclosures in your packet that you're doing for your buyer. So, feel free to have us reach out, have us look over your documents. We're here to help you, and we'll be able to tell you, hey, you're missing this one or you're missing that one. So we don't expect you to know all of this up front. That's why I'm just kind of giving you an overview today. The next document I'm going to be talking about is only going to be, if you're only going to use this document if your buyer is getting either a VA loan, which is a Veterans Affairs loan, or you are getting an FHA loan. So these are two government loans. If your buyer is there's a couple different loans out there, and I do advise you all to be somewhat familiar with the different types of loans. Conventional is what we consider to be a standard loan. It's just a normal bank to private investor or private bank to buyer. However, we have things like FHA loans and VA loans that are government loans. If your buyer has been pre-approved for either a VA or an FHA, you have to include this document. So when you're talking to your buyer and you start asking them about the type of financing they've gotten approved for, make sure you're realizing, what are they getting approved for, a conventional or an FHA or a VA? Okay, so you need to know the type of loan they're getting. So again, if your buyer is getting an FHA or a VA loan, this document has to be included. This is a disclosure to the seller, telling the seller that we have a special type of buyer. This type of buyer may require more time, usually 45 days to close, as opposed to 30 days with a conventional. So this particular buyer is going to need a little more time. Also with this buyer, it's also important that the purchase price matches the appraisal, or at least is equal to appraisal value. The appraised value on this property. So what happens is you put in an offer, the lender starts processing that offer, and the lender is going to send an appraiser out to the property to come up with an appraised value. the value of the appraisal has to match or be above our purchase price. So if I have a purchase price of $200,000 for my FHA buyer, I'm going to be putting that in right here. So I'm going to put 200,000 in here. This property has to appraise at least for 200,000. The reason why is it's a government loan. They want to make sure that the money they're lending you is going to a property that's worth the purchase price. So if the property comes back and it's only appraised for 190,000, this allows your VA and FHA buyer to back out of the contract because it did not appraise to what it was supposed to be. So it's really important that you have this document included in your offer if you're representing a buyer or a seller with an FHA or VA financing, because it gives them the opportunity to make sure that it's appraised. It also gives them a little bit of extra time to be able to get the loan approved. Okay. If you are representing a buyer and a seller, if you're representing a buyer for a VA or an FHA loan, please allow 45 days to closing. So if you're writing a contract today, which is the 25th, I would probably give the contract to maybe mid-September to close. You want to give the lender 45 calendar days to be able to close that property. So make sure you're scheduling the closing on the contract for at least 45 days to give that buyer a little bit more time to close an FHA or a VA loan. I'm going to stop for 1 second. Make sure we've got no questions. Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, no problem. I'm going to go back to my screen. So we're now going to be talking about, we talked about the FHA and VA rider, which is important if you're dealing with that sort of special buyer. If you're not, if your buyer is getting a conventional loan, you don't need to include that document. It's only if they're getting an FHA and VA. Okay, the next document I'm going to be showing you is going to be the appraisal contingency form. So when a buyer who is getting financing, the lender will send an appraiser out. We just talked about that. So whenever you have a buyer that's getting financing, the lender is going to send an appraiser out to that property to make sure it appraises. But if you're dealing with a cash buyer, there is no appraisal necessary because there's no lender involved. There's no lender that cares about the value. It's the buyer buying it cash. So the buyer has the right to get an appraisal, but it's not based or contingent upon that appraisal. So what I like to do is if you are representing a cash buyer, somebody that is paying all cash, no loan involved, make sure you include this addendum. The reason why is this says that even though that my buyer is paying cash or whatever it is they're doing, the property must appraise at least the purchase price. So again, if my buyer is paying $200,000 for a property, and let's say my cash buyer decides to go and buy an appraisal and have an appraiser come back at their expense, the appraiser comes back at 190. This allows my buyer to say, wait a minute, it did not appraise at the purchase price. I'm not going to pay more than what the property is worth. So this allows me to back out of the contract. Okay, so if you're representing a cash buyer, regardless of whether or not they choose to get an appraisal, the idea is you have a little bit of a protection built in if they decide to get an appraisal, but it protects them to make sure that the appraisal price is at a minimum of the purchase price. Okay, so that is the appraisal contingency. The next form we're going to be talking about is going to be the lead-based paint disclosure. This document is only required if the property was built before 1978. So if the property's 1977 or above, 1976, the year I was born, but if it's 1977 and older, you've got to make sure you include this document. So again, anything before 1978, make sure you include this document. In here basically is a lead-based paint disclosure. So it goes through and it asks the seller. So again, this is one of those documents that really needs to come from the seller first. So again, if you have an older property, maybe the property was built in the 1930s or 1940s, ask the listing agent if they have a lead-based paint disclosure. This is something that the seller fills out, and it is their disclosure saying, yes, I know that there's been lead, or no, I have no knowledge of any lead-based paint, whatever it is. There is a pamphlet you want to include to give to your buyers called Protect Your Family from Lead-Based Paint, and have your buyers then initial this. This is getting it out in the open, being transparent. Does the seller know of any lead-based paint issues? Yes or no? The buyer acknowledging what the seller knows. So it's really an acknowledgement back and forth. Yes, is there something we need to know? And everybody is being upfront and honest and very transparent. We know what's going on with this property. So if the property was built before 1978, make sure you include the lead-based paint disclosure. Okay, the next one is going to be the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. So this document is something that, you know, a lot of agents have their buyers sign. Some agents don't. As a practice, when I was selling, there was a few situations where I did use this form, but for the most part, I didn't. So we all know that buyers can pretty much use whoever they want. They can use me, they can use Maria, they can use Courtney, they can use anybody they want. Only until I have an actual offer signed with that buyer is that buyer locked to me. So let me give you a situation of when you would use this form. Now, this form essentially locks you into that buyer. It essentially says that if this buyer buys property meeting this description in this amount of time, even if they try to use another agent, they are actually locked into using you. So it actually locks you into the buyer using you for this transaction. Now, I don't necessarily use this form a lot because not many buyers are going to want to sign it, because it does kind of handcuff them into using me. The way I've always operated my business is I said, listen, I want you to be happy with me. If you're not happy with me, you can go somewhere else and choose somebody else. But let me give you a really good example of why I would use this document in which situation. Years ago, when the market crashed in 07, 08, properties were selling very, very cheap, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for a 3-bedroom home. It was insane how bad the market was. I had an investor that was calling me on a regular basis, and he was calling me from overseas, asking me to go and visit different homes, take photos, bring repair guys out to do bids on it and all this different stuff. So I was doing a lot of legwork for this particular buyer. I found out a few days later that this specific investor was also calling a friend of mine and another friend of mine. So I had mutual people that I knew that were also getting phone calls from this investor. So he had 4 or 5 of us all running around town, all doing the same things, taking pictures, visiting, doing bids, meeting repair guys, and all doing all this stuff. But nobody had any sort of loyalty. He was never loyal to any of us. So I called him up and I said, listen, I perfectly don't mind doing the extra legwork, but I need some sort of loyalty and commitment on your end. I need to know that I am the only agent you're using, because any of my efforts, I want to make sure that I'm going to get paid on, right? Because we don't get paid until we have a closing. So in that particular situation, I had this particular investor sign an exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, basically saying that he's going to be loyal to me, and if he buys a property, and there's actual criteria, in this case we say anywhere in Florida. I want anywhere in Florida you purchase, you need to use me. So I actually had my buyer sign this agreement, and it forced him to be loyal to just me. So all my other friends stopped getting phone calls. He was loyal to me, and I continued my arrangement with him doing properties and things like that. So that's a great situation of why you would want to use this. If you have really loyal buyers that you know are dedicated to you, there's no need to bring this document out. But if you have somebody that you feel is contacting several different agents and maybe they're not really loyal to you, and you don't want to do any extra work because you know that they have 2 or 3 other agents they're talking to, then you could bring out this form if you can get them to sign it. Okay, so that's kind of what the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement is. It is the buyer saying that if he decides to buy within this certain time frame and this certain criteria, that you will be the only agent representing him in that transaction. Okay, I'm going to stop for just a second. Again, I want to make sure I don't have any questions. It looks like we are good so far. Okay, perfect. Okay, very good. I'm going to go back to my screen. Okay, so we just went over the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. The next form we're going to be talking about, my screen comes up, is going to be the sale of buyer's property. So if you have a buyer and that buyer has to sell their existing house before they can close on this house, you need to include this. So let me give you an example. I have a buyer from Connecticut that has to sell their home in Connecticut to be able to use the funds from that property to be able to close on this property. We're talking about simultaneous closings. One property closes, the proceeds from that closing go down to another title company, and it's used to buy another property. With that said, if my buyer cannot buy the Florida property without the Connecticut property closing, I need to include this. Okay, what this document does is it says that without the property in Connecticut closing, this one isn't going to close. If you have this situation and you neglect to include this, your buyer can't back out of it because their sale fell through in Connecticut. So you have to make sure that if this property that they're purchasing through you is contingent upon another one closing, this has to be included. And you'll simply go through and fill this out. If they have a contract on their property in Connecticut, you will need to provide the seller of the property in Florida with a copy of that contract so they know that it's a legitimate deal. If you run across the situation, again, ask your manager for advice, but this is the document we're going to advise you to use. So again, if you have a buyer that tells you, I have to make sure my other property closes before I can purchase this property, this is a red flag. Make sure you include this document. Okay. The next one we're going to be talking about is going to be the FIRPTA disclosure. So if you are representing a buyer and the seller happens to be a foreign person, so you're representing the buyer and everything's great, but the seller happens to not be a U.S. resident, you will need to include what's called FIRPTA. FIRPTA is the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. So this is something that at closing, there's going to be a withholding that is kept from the seller's proceeds in order to prove that they have been paying their taxes. And there's something that the title company is going to work with that seller. They're going to take care of this with the seller, but this is your acknowledgement. It has to be disclosed to all parties that the seller is a foreign person. Now, only when a foreign person sells a property is this going to be required. If your buyer is foreign, there's nothing different that's going to happen with a sale. So again, if you're representing the buyer and the buyer is a foreign person, nothing is going to be different with the transaction. It's going to be a normal transaction like we do. It's only until somebody sells a property and they're a foreign seller does FIRPTA apply. Because what the government's going to do is the government needs to make sure that the seller has been paying their appropriate taxes. So at closing, they withhold a little bit. It's still the seller's money, but they have to prove that the seller's been paying their normal taxes. The seller will work with the title company on this, but all you have to know is if you're working with a buyer and the seller happens to be a foreign person or persons, your buyer will need to sign this disclosure acknowledging that the seller is a foreign person. Okay, so that's all this is. It just is a disclosure. Again, the whole idea with these disclosures is we want everybody to be on the same page. We want everybody to know what's going on. We want initials and signatures so that everybody is transparent. We all know what's going on with the situation. There isn't any surprise. So that's what this FIRPTA disclosure is. Again, if the seller is foreign, you'll need to include this in your offer. And this is, again, something you'll normally get from the listing agent, but if you prepare it as a buyer's agent, you can do that as well. Okay, the next document we're going to be talking about is going to be the request for repairs. So the request for repairs and remedies is let's say you are working with a buyer and that buyer gets a home inspection, and that home inspection comes back with 4 different suggested repairs. Maybe there's some wood rot. Maybe, one of the electrical outlets needs to be fixed. Maybe there's a little bit of water intrusion near one of the windows. If you are requesting the seller to repair some of these items, you can use this particular document to do that. So here's where you can list the different items straight from the home inspection. If there's items that were taken off of a termite report, so if you had a WDO, otherwise known as a termite report done, and maybe that termite report came back with some wood rot or existing termites or whatever, you can also add these particular items. Whenever you're doing this, I would also suggest attaching a copy of the home inspection or the WDO report. That way the seller and the listing agent have a copy of what the inspector's report was, so that they can make the decision on whether or not they want those repairs, to be done. So if you are requesting repairs for the seller to take care of, you can use this form and then just have the buyer and seller sign it at the bottom. Okay. I'm going to stop for 1 second. I'm just going to take a look at my chat, make sure everything's good. I think we're all good there. Yep. Okay, perfect. Okay. So the next one we're going to be talking about is going to be the walkthrough inspection. So one of the biggest things you'll hear me talk about is to make sure that before the property closes. Okay, so let's say you have a deal. You've gotten through the home inspection, you've negotiated repairs, you've gotten the loan approved, and now we're days away from closing. You've already got the closing scheduled, you're counting your money, you're ready to go. Make sure before the property closes, you do a walkthrough inspection. This is your last chance to get eyes on the property before it closes. You will want to do this the day before, but preferably the day of closing. So scenario is your buyers are coming into town at 1 o'clock to meet you at the title company to close on the property that they're purchasing. Arrange to meet the buyer at 12 o'clock over at the property to do a final walkthrough. What you're going to be looking for is this. Make sure that any repairs that were requested are done. Make sure there are no leaks or issues that have popped up since you had your home inspection. Things happen, properties flood. I will tell you a story. So years ago, we had I had an office, and I had my partner, and we had a bank-owned property that we had listed. The day before closing, my partner went over to the property. We were the listing agents. We went to actually do a walkthrough to make sure that the property was okay for the buyer the next day. We went and looked at the property, and the property looked good the day before. The buyer and the buyer's agent the next morning, the day of closing, go back to the property to do a final walkthrough. Overnight, the property had completely flooded. There was a plumbing burst, whatever happened. It was a 2-story building. The entire downstairs was completely flooded. The buyer's agent calls me panicking, saying, we're an hour away from closing. The property's flooded. What do we do? Luckily, Fannie Mae, who was the owner, and it was a bank-owned property, said, that's it. Postpone the closing for 3 more days. They went in, they took care of getting rid of the water, they took care of replacing the carpet, they got the property back in perfect condition. We delayed the closing 3 days. The buyer did the walkthrough, property looked perfect, they closed on the property. Make sure if you're representing the buyer, do a walkthrough, do it the day of closing. A lot can happen overnight. Because what happens is once your buyer goes to the closing table, and they sign those documents, they are accepting that property in that condition. So if you forget to do a walkthrough and you're like, oh, we'll just go after closing. Closing has happened. Your buyers have now taken possession of the property, and guess what? Oh no, there's a leak. What are we going to do? Well, guess what? Your buyers already closed on it. It's too late. Chances are the seller's not going to do anything. Your buyers have already closed on the property. So again, before it closes, make sure you're going either with the buyer or without the buyer. Make sure you're doing a property inspection of the property before closing. Because once your buyers have closed on the property, they have accepted the condition of the property, and it's going to be very hard to get anything fixed after the fact. Okay, so this is just a little walkthrough addendum, just noting any issues that you found during it. But again, the idea with this is make sure you do a walkthrough inspection. Okay, let's see what else we have. We're almost down to the bottom. Okay, so let's say, and we all know that the Florida as-is contract is based a lot on deadlines. So regardless of what contract you're using, whether it's a residential contract, vacant land contract, commercial contract, all of these contracts have certain deadlines relating to the contract. Maybe it's the closing date or the inspection date or the loan approval date. If you need to extend any of your important dates, whether it's the inspection period, maybe you need to extend the closing date another week, maybe your lender told you he's not going to be able to get the loan approval, so you want to extend that another week. This is the form you're going to use. This is a very simple form, and it relates to all of our various contracts, whether it's residential, vacant land, or commercial. You can use this particular extension form for all of them. So you would simply come here, you'd fill out the effective date, buyer and seller's information, property address, and relating to us with residential, you can extend the closing date, you can extend the financing period, and you can extend the inspection period. So you could do it for a number of days, or you could do it to a certain date. If you're dealing with vacant land or commercial, you have some other categories, but us in residential, these are the three you're going to be focused on. So if you need to extend the closing date, if your lender tells you I need more time to get the loan approval, that's the financing period. Or maybe the inspector needs more time to be able to go in and do an inspection. This is where you can also extend that inspection period. Has to be signed by the buyers and the sellers to be a valid extension. So make sure that when your buyers have signed it, you send this over to listing agents so that they can have their sellers sign it to make the extension valid. That's the extension contract. And I'm going to go back, and I think we just have one or two more, guys. We're right on time today. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is the home inspection disclosure. So there will be times, you know, as agents, it is very important for you to always recommend that your buyers get a home inspection and a WDO, also called wood destroying organisms or termite inspection. A lot of times buyers may not choose to get the termite inspection. If there's a loan involved, the lender will usually require it, but we always definitely suggest getting a home inspection. This is your buyer's ability to get a full and extensive report noting every single defect that that property has. You know, GFCI outlets, there's an issue with the AC, there's an issue with, you know, some of the doors closing, whatever it is, there's issues with the house. We want a full report that's going to tell us all of those issues. Your buyer will pay for a home inspection. Make sure you're getting it done during the inspection period. But your buyer will pay for this at time of the inspection, and that is theirs that they own. So they own that inspection, and it's up to them if they want to share it with anybody. The only time I would include this disclosure is if your buyer elects not to get a home inspection. You're thinking, well, why would a buyer not want to get a home inspection? Let's say the buyer is a general contractor. Let's say it's a husband and wife, and they own a contracting company, and they're general contractors themselves. They probably know just as much about that property as a home inspector. So they're thinking to themselves, why would I spend $300 on a home inspection when we can look at it ourselves? So if your buyers elect not to do a home inspection that we recommend, it's a good idea to get this filled out. The reason why is it protects you, the agent, and us, Cariote. Because if the buyer were to come back to us and say, Katie never recommended a home inspection, then I can come back and say, well, yes, I did, but you elected not to have one. Okay, so again, we want to make sure we always advise our buyers to get a home inspection. If your buyer says, not going to get one, not going to waste my money, not worth it, I can see the issues myself, have them sign this disclosure saying that they elect not to perform any inspections. That way it protects you because you've told them to get one, but they decided not to. So it does protect you from any liability. Okay, so this is just a nice covering your own self, covering your license, making sure you're protecting yourself as well. Last but not least, I have one more form to talk about today. And that form is going to be the wire fraud prevention notice. So if you were on our most recent sales call last week, you would have heard me talk about this particular notice. Wire fraud is running rampant in our industry. A lot of times we are seeing fraudulent emails being sent posing as title companies, giving out fraudulent wiring information and money being exchanged. I'll tell you one of our personal experiences that we went through a couple years ago. We had a buyer that was paying cash for a property, a very significant amount of cash, in excess of $250,000. Somebody had hacked his email. We're watching his email, monitoring his email, staying very quiet, but monitoring our buyer's email. Right at the right time, this scammer posed as the title company, sent our buyer wiring instructions. Our buyer did not verify the wiring instructions, did not call the title company to verify it, ended up going down to his bank and wiring $250,000 to a bogus wiring account. Now, it was legitimate. It went somewhere else. It actually left the United States. It went to a different country. We actually had to get the FBI involved because now we're talking about international wire fraud. It was a big deal. $250,000 gone because the buyer did not verify where he was wiring money to. This happens a lot. The best thing you can do is always make sure that your buyers and sellers talk directly to the title company. You do not want to be the go-between by delivering wiring instructions. If the buyer needs to wire money to the title company or attorney, have them get those wiring instructions directly from that title company. When he gets it, he or she gets it, make sure they're also then calling back and verifying that, yes, indeed, I have the right wiring instructions. Once that money leaves the bank account, and in this case, leaves the country, that money's gone, and there's no way to get that money back. Okay, so protect your buyers. If it's $500,000 or $500, make sure your buyers are verifying wiring instructions. You know, we are dealing with a very technological industry right now, or technological world where, you know, people are taking over and doing, fraudulent emails. They're doing, posing as people. They're doing, whatever it is, but they're really, you know, they're doing all these things. So it's really important to make sure that anything that comes from the title company, don't get involved with. Don't be the one picking up money or exchanging money or giving wiring instructions. Let the buyers and sellers deal directly with the title company, because that's who's going to be taking care of that. So I want to go ahead and stop for a minute because we're pretty much done here, but I do have a couple of questions. No. Okay, so good question. Somebody said, does any of these need to be notarized? There's nothing on our contracts that ever have to be notarized. In fact, the only time a buyer ever has to notarize anything is if they're getting a loan. So if the buyer is getting a loan and they're ready to close on it, at closing, they will be required to sign their closing documents in front of a notary. As far as we're concerned with agents, we don't have to notarize everything. The contract is as good. It's only when they go to closing and they have a loan will they have to get things notarized. If you have a cash buyer, there is no notary required. They're basically just signing documents and getting that back to the title company. So very good question, but no, none of the documents we're talking about today need to be notarized. It's only until they close and they're closing with a loan that they need to have that done. When is the best time to give wire prevention notice? I would do this at time of offer, because you can always include this. You know, I like to make it easy. Whenever you're dealing with a buyer, you don't want to have them sign certain documents today and certain documents tomorrow. It's really nice and simple to be able to send everything in one bulk signing to that buyer and have them sign all at once. So all of the things we're talking about today, the seller's property disclosure, wire fraud, if you can get everything compiled at once, have your buyer sign all of that at once. That way it makes it very easy to be able to get it done in one swipe, get it over to list listing agent and you have it all together. So probably just do it all at the time of offer. The only thing I would ever send prior to offer would be that energy efficiency brochure. And again, there's nothing they need to sign. It's just simply sending it over to them in an email. Does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or ask in the chat box. But other than that, it looks like that's all I have to cover today. Now, I'm not saying that this is all of the documents you're going to encounter. Throughout the course of your real estate career, you're going to be coming across dozens of different disclosures and addenda that we didn't have time to talk about today. Today, I wanted to talk about the most frequently used ones that you will come across. Again, there will be many, many more. So the best thing I can do is suggest to you, when you have an offer, and maybe it's your first time putting in an offer, have a manager look at it. You know, I'll tell an agent, hey, you're missing this form, you're missing that form. You know, is it a FERPTA? You know, we'll ask those questions to make sure you have the right forms. But that's really all there is today, guys. You know, the great thing about the forms and documents we have is we didn't write them. They were written by attorneys. All we have to do is fill in the blanks, get them signed. So there's very little we have to do as far as writing things and coming up with verbiage. Most things we already have a document for. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time today. Thank you once again for joining me. Once this is over, like I said, I do have this class already on our YouTube channel, but if you want something of this, if you want a recording of this specific video, let me know and I'd be happy to send it to you. Also, if you ever need anything, I'm going to put my name and email address in the text box. I am the manager of both our Celebration and Windermere offices. I've been doing this about 20 years. If you need help with contracts and maybe your manager is not available, you can always reach out to me. I'd be happy to look at them. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your time today. Thank you and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.